So we'll just do quick introductions ourselves, and then we'll just jump right in. And hopefully you'll hear something new that you haven't already heard in another workshop this weekend. And I applaud you all for coming on a beautiful day, at least where we are. So we're in Western Massachusetts. I think most of you are probably from the eastern part of the state. So I'm Ruth Ever. I'm a public health educator. Been working mostly around substance abuse prevention, violence prevention for the last 20 or 30 years. 20 years or so in Western Mass, and right now I'm working very part-time with the trauma-informed Hampshire County. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but Chase, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Chase Giroux, and I'm a licensed mental health counselor, and I'm a director of community education at Clinical Support Options. We have a variety of sites across Western Mass, and I'm very grateful to be part of the Trauma-Informed Hampshire County Coalition that Ruth will speak about in just a few. And so the trauma work is so important to me, both on a personal and professional level, being both a survivor of trauma and working very closely with children and families who also experience complex trauma. And I have so much respect for each and every one of you. I too used to work in the school system, and especially during these very challenging times. I appreciate all that you're doing, showing up every day for our young people. And I also have two young children in elementary school as well. So thank you so much for being here and looking forward to sharing space with you.
Thanks, Chase. And I guess I want to just mention that I have worked with or in schools for pretty much most of my or all of my career doing underage substance abuse prevention, things like that, the last 6 years in the East Hampton School District, in the middle school, embedded in the school. So I too have a lot of respect for teachers, even though I haven't been one, and the paraprofessionals and the custodians and the bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, and had great relationships, and they were such great allies to me in the work that we were doing as a coalition in that city. So we're excited to be here because we know how much that you all are interacting with the young people and what a difference you can make. And it's great to see in the chat. I know Chase can't see the chat because she's got the PowerPoint up, but people are sharing just one person I thought articulated it so well. Let me see if I can quickly find it, where Bonnie said that she works with 7th and 8th graders and she wants to learn more about supporting students who come to school every day with so much stress and trauma that they simply cannot leave at the door and impacts their school experience.
Yeah.
And that really sums it up. So Trauma-Informed Hampshire County is in the western part of the state. We're a broad network of organizations. Our main mission is to raise awareness about the impact of trauma and adversity on us as individuals, as families, and especially as a community as a whole and in the whole county. So we're excited to be part of this. This is a little broader, obviously, than our county, but it seemed like a great opportunity that we wanted to take advantage of. We'd love people to have their cameras on. It's nice to see folks. I know it's with the PowerPoint, it's hard to see everybody anyway, but of course, do what you need to take care of yourself. If you're zoomed out or you're, the talk itself can sometimes be triggering for folks. We're talking about adversity in childhood and trauma, and as you may already know or are going to learn, a lot of people, large percent, have this in their history, and so talking about it can sometimes bring up some feelings. So we do also encourage you to do whatever you need to take care of yourself. So when we look at the most challenging problems in any community in the state or across the country, opioid addiction, homelessness, teen pregnancy, suicide, things like that, the common thread for all of them is a history of trauma. And when you look across the sectors in our communities, like schools, social services, police, even private businesses, whether we realize it or not, we are serving a large percent of people and employees that are impacted by trauma. So this is something that we feel like we want to address on multiple levels. All right, so let's start with just a quick kind of brainstorming in the chat. When I hear the word trauma, I think of, if you could just put maybe one word, 2 words just in the chat real quick, what comes up for you? I'll just read a bunch of them out. It can happen to anyone at any stage of life. Yes. Sad, harmful life events. Things that happen to people that challenge them but do not have to define them. When you hear the word trauma, what do you think of? Just any association you have with the word. Devastation evokes profound shame,
Mm.
shock, response to tragedy, pain, numbness, depression, out, physical or emotional injury, universal, neglect, abuse.
Mm.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So we're going to be addressing a lot of this today. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Chase to get us all on the same page with definitions.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Um, yeah, so like Bruce said, I'm going to review some definitions just to get everyone on the same page. And so the first definition that we want to talk about is what is psychological trauma? And so trauma is a unique individual experience of an event or enduring situation where the person's ability to integrate their emotional experience is overwhelmed and the person experiences it as physically or emotionally harmful and sometimes life-threatening. And so I really want to stress the unique individual experience part of that definition, pointing out that different people, even in the same family, can experience the same events and have very different short and long-term reactions. And so I'd like to give the example of two people driving in a car together, having an accident. So for one person, it may feel very traumatic, but while for the other, perhaps no big deal. And so there are factors that could influence these different reactions, and those include perhaps the age that it occurred, if they have a support system, if they had previous car accidents, their temperament, if there's other stresses in the person's life, maybe the experience when they talked about it. And so next, important definition is what is adversity? And so those are difficult life circumstances or events that may be extremely stressful and can have negative health outcomes. And so childhood adversity, when the circumstances or events happen in childhood, they can be especially harmful. And I think even more important, systemic oppression, right? It intensifies adversity for marginalized groups, such as people of color and those who identify as LGBTQIA+. And I really want to emphasize again that adversity is generally more harmful when experienced in childhood. So usually the earlier the trauma, the more impactful. And some adverse events are not traumatic, right, depending on the situation and the person. So for example, parental divorce, it could be very traumatic with long-lasting impact, and for others, maybe not. And I think a really important definition is what is resilience? And so that's a successful adaptation in the face of biological challenges and stressful or traumatic life events. And so resilience factors, it buffers the impact of adversity and trauma. And so this is often described as the ability to bounce back from difficult events. And so one of the most important resilience factors is the presence of a stable, caring relationship in one's life. And that could be many, many of you. And so people who are able to thrive in spite of adversity and trauma often talk about someone from their school, like yourselves, maybe a coach, a neighbor, a friend's parent that they connected with and supported them. We're gonna unpack that a little bit more too as we move through this. And so the next few slides, these are common responses to trauma. And perhaps some of these responses you may have experienced in your school as well. So while I'm not going to read all of them, I'll allow you to sort of look through that. I want to bring your attention to a couple of them. So this is common responses to trauma in young people. And so I want to bring and point out the thinking brain goes offline, emotional brain activates that fight or flight response. And I suspect that this may show up a lot in your classroom at your school. And we see that as a student who we think isn't paying attention or is causing a distraction or maybe even trying to leave your class, which can all be very frustrating. And I think we see a lot too, the regressing behaviors. And this appears where the child is far below the developmental stage of their other classmates. And next, responses to trauma in school-age children. And then here, I think we see a lot that somatic complaints, right? Headaches and stomach aches, those belly aches. And so again, this can really interrupt learning at times. And a lot of our children too, in our classrooms and in our schools, they have difficulty concentrating, which may make a lot of sense because it's difficult to learn something new when all they can think about is returning to maybe a very unsafe home. And I think a very common response to trauma that we see at school particularly are angry outbursts. And last but not least, there are adolescents, right? And in all three age groups, a common thread was that fear and anxiety and worry and shame, those all show up. But in adolescence, mood swings are far more intense as their body is changing and they have more access to media. They're exploring their identity. Social relationships all come into the picture. All right, so as you're going to see in a video that we're going to show in just a few moments, stress can be a very good thing. So there are three kinds of stress. So stress, it could be quite positive, right? Meaning it motivates us and helps us to survive dangerous threats. And this is different from tolerable stress, which is more intense and can feel awful, but it's ultimately tolerable. For example, like a death of a loved one, maybe an illness or an accident. And then finally, there's toxic stress, which you'll hear about in this video we're going to show, which is prolonged activation of stress in the absence of protective relationship. So Dan, I'm going to stop sharing my screen if you're able to get that video up for us.
Yep.
Do you want to just introduce it first, Chase, before he starts it?
I sure do, Ruth. Yeah, so excuse me. And let me get this going again, sorry. Oops, Vicky. All right, hold on 1 second. So can you see Dan's video right now? Ruth?
I don't think so. Oh, well, it's ready to go.
All right, so Dan, just to be a moment, just to introduce it. So this video is going to be about 2.5 minutes long. And as you're watching it, I invite you to think about, does this remind you of anyone you've known where many things, even small things, seem like a threat? I wanted to share as well that Ta-Nehisi Coates, a well-known African-American writer who grew up in an inner city Baltimore, surrounded by violence, he described his childhood by saying, each day, 1/3 of my brain was concerned with who I was walking to school with, our precise number, the manner of our walk, the number of times I smiled, and who or what I smiled at. And so he says, I can hear my father telling me, walk like you have a place to be. Keep your head on a swivel. And so that is the impact of toxic stress, which, especially without the buffer of resilience factors, like we talked about, like a caring relationship, can have a lasting impact. So go ahead, Dan.
The reality is that we all need a certain amount of stress, a certain amount of anxiety to perform well. If we don't care about that exam that we're going to have tomorrow, we'll probably fail. If we're going to cross the street and a truck is coming at us, we have release of adrenaline. We have release of a hormone that we call cortisol. We want to jump out of there, and adrenaline and cortisol are going to help us do that. So there's that good amount of stress. But if all day long you're feeling like a truck is coming at you, day after day after day, that's going to take a toll on the body. And the amygdala obviously here has greater activation.
Yes.
In the PTSD. We were able to image children that had experienced trauma and compare those brain images with children that didn't have an experience of trauma and didn't have symptoms.
Right, an exaggerated fear response.
An exaggerated fear response with decreased activation in areas that we need to control that emotion in the frontal areas.
Exposure to early adversity and trauma literally affects the structure and function of children's developing brains. So the kid next to them hits them, or the teacher reprimands them in a way that they're uncomfortable with, right? Literally what they're feeling, that activation is like there was a truck coming at them. You can give something that will mask symptoms, right? For example, if someone has a cough, right, you can give them a really strong cough serum that will suppress their cough. But if it's because they have tuberculosis or lung cancer, then what you're doing is merely masking the symptoms while the disease process continues to fester. We know what's happening in children's brains and bodies with the experience of toxic stress. So the question now is, what do we do about it?
Thank you, Dan.
All right, so while we're getting our PowerPoint back up, I'm just going to ask how many people have heard of the ACE study? I can see a few of you, if you can show of hands. Okay, a couple people. Great. We like to call it, the study you've never heard of, because it's for about 20 years after it was published, almost nobody knew about it and very few people were talking about it. And that's really changing now. And now the language of being trauma informed and understanding adverse childhood experiences is becoming really prevalent. I'm going to say again that sometimes this can be hard stuff to hear because of our own adversity and our own past. And we're not talking theoretically about a them. We're often talking about us. So good to remember that trauma and adversity is not destiny and that resilience factors counteract the impact of trauma. So I'm not an expert on the ACEs study. I'm actually going to put in a chat. Let me see if this will come up. Two studies, two sites, URLs for places that have a lot more information about this study if you want to learn more about it. But I'm going to give you kind of a basic summary and we're going to just go through it, some key pieces about it. So in the 1990s, there was a doctor in California as part of the health maintenance organization Kaiser Permanente. And he kept noticing that the women in his obesity program would lose large amounts of weight and then they would gain it all back again very quickly. And it made him suspect that something else was going on. So he began asking them about their histories as children, and he found that a very large percentage of them had been sexually abused. So what seemed to him like a solution, losing weight, actually posed problems for them because it was a protective factor for them. And he started to wonder if trauma in childhood was having a large impact on their health as adults. So he was curious about this connection, and he teamed up with a researcher at the CDC, at the Center for Disease Control, and they sent out a questionnaire to this huge sample of patients who were part of this California HMO. And as you can see, the sample represented a very mainstream, comparatively privileged portion of society. They all had insurance. They're basically middle income or above. 75% of them had attended college. And in the questionnaire, they asked patients how many different types of these 10 different adverse childhood experiences had they experienced. And depending on their answers, the patients got an ACE score of 0 to 10. So if you had one of those incidences, you got an ACE score of 1. If you had none of them, it was a 0, etc., up to 10. So we're not going to discuss this, but you may be looking at this and doing some quick calculations in your own head of what your own ACE score is. So just going to remind you again that Some of these events may not be experienced as traumatic, as Chase had given the example of like a divorce. For some people, that's a traumatic experience, and for others, not so much. So we do recognize that individual experience. And again, this doesn't reflect the protective or resilience factors that people have. What you're seeing on the right, there it goes, is some newer thinking and research about ACEs that has expanded to include these 5 more areas of adverse experiences. And it's very possible that these issues are as impactful, if not more impactful, than some of the original 10 ACE categories. It's really important that these were added because many of them solely or especially impact people of color. And you can't talk about childhood adversity without recognizing things like racism, living in unsafe neighborhoods, witnessing violence that are highly stressful and often traumatic. So efforts to address ACEs have been and are going to continue to go hand in hand with work on equity and racial justice issues. Okay, so let's talk about the data itself. When the researchers analyzed their responses, they were surprised and often shocked at the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences in this, as we said, generally privileged sample of people. So about a third of them had no ACEs, which is the blue bar there. 64% of them had at least one, or had, yeah, at least one, and almost 13% of them had 4 or more. And in a quarter of the households, there was substance abuse, and in a quarter of the households, people said that they had been physically abused. And remember, this was a privileged sample. So since the researchers had the full medical records of these participants who are all part of this HMO, they then started to look to see whether there was a connection between the number of ACEs and negative health outcomes. And so first they looked at the things that you might predict: suicide, depression, substance abuse. And what they found was that participants who had a high number of ACEs also had higher rates of negative health outcomes. What was stunning, however, was that with each additional ACE, so each additional adverse childhood experience that somebody had, there were higher rates of the problem. This is very unusual in research to see such a close connection. This is what's called a linear dose to response relationship because of the way that that bar graph just goes straight up in response to the number of ACEs. So if you compare people with 0 ACEs to people with 4+ ACEs, the people with 4+ are 6 times more likely to attempt suicide, 7 times more likely to have had sex by the age of 15, and 46 times more likely to have injected drugs. So then they looked at other, more physical or medical negative health outcomes, beyond the mental health and substance abuse issues. And these results stunned the researchers even more. They found that, again, there was a close connection, and it also followed, as you can see, that same linear pattern. The more ACEs, the higher percentage of people who had negative health outcomes. So what we're looking at here is heart disease, lung disease, and obesity. We could show you the same slides for liver disease, cancer, diabetes, asthma, and others, and the pattern is exactly the same. So this means that repeated, unpredictable, and unanticipated stress, like ACEs, has a lifelong impact on mental and physical health. Trauma impacts people physiologically on a cellular level. If you compare people with 0 ACEs to people with 4 or more ACEs, the people with 4+ are 2 times more likely to get cancer, heart disease, and obesity. And next is a similar graph related to job performance. The more ACEs you have, the higher the absenteeism, the more serious financial problems, and the more serious job problems. So ACEs are impacting our work lives as well. Okay, so remember that the original Kaiser sample was a mainstream, relatively privileged group that they studied. So what this graph compares is the original sample in the dark blue with a sample of girls in the juvenile justice system, which is the green. And as you can see, the juvenile justice girls overall have much higher ACEs scores. It was 12.5% in the original sample that had 4 or more ACEs. 60% of the girls here had 4 or more ACEs who were in the juvenile justice system. So you can imagine the negative health outcomes for folks at higher risk in our community. Thank you. Um, Okay, and actually, I just want to, while I'm thinking of it, somebody asked in the chat about getting the slides. You can, at the end, we're going to give an email address, and if you want to email us, we have a PDF of the slides that we would be happy to share with you. And I believe that this recording will also be up on the website for the MTA. All right, so the last thing to say about this this whole study is what it doesn't talk about, and that is so important, and that is resiliency. Resiliency describes all the factors that strengthen well-being and help people endure adversity and trauma. So research has identified a common set of factors that predispose children to positive outcomes in the face of significant adversity, especially with the help of supportive relationships, which is what we've been talking about a lot already. People generally can overcome the impact of trauma. Even one positive relationship can have a huge impact on a child's life and their ability to integrate and handle that trauma. All right, so I want to just end this section kind of recognizing that, as we've been saying, a lot of times we are personally affected by this, or we have loved ones in our lives who are. And we know that probably 6 out of 10 people on this webinar have at least one ACE, and some have more. And someone, thank you for sharing that in the chat, so that she had quite a few of them. So we want to leave you with some ideas about what to do if this applies to you. Even if you think it happened a long time ago and maybe it doesn't matter, it can still have an impact on us in ways that we aren't always aware of. So the first thing is just acknowledging the ACEs to yourself can help you to take control of your health. Talking to a trusted person about this history is really critical. It's common, I think it's early on, people talked about the word shame being associated with trauma, and a lot of times there is shame and stigma associated with it. So letting others know about it can help reduce that shame and lead to healing. Since the history of trauma impacts our bodies and can lead to what some are calling a trauma physiology and real health problems, it can be really helpful to talk to your doctor and medical providers about your past, even if they haven't asked about it, because this can impact how your doctor treats your health conditions and works with you as a patient. And if you don't think that your providers are sensitive to this or know about it, you might try to urge your doctor to learn what a history of trauma can mean for taking care of your health. Hopefully that will keep changing, but it's still not commonplace. A history of trauma can make it hard for us to manage strong emotions like fear, anxiety, anger. There are skills that we can learn to keep our emotions more even and regulated, and it's probably what a lot of you do with the kids in the classroom. Since trauma can impact us on a cellular level, folks with high ACE scores need probably more than most people to really take good care of their bodies, whatever that means for you, going to the doctor regularly, eating well, getting exercise, sleep. And finally, if you have children, you may be wondering, either the kids in your school, which is why a lot of you are here, or your own children, how do we prevent ACEs and trauma in our kids' lives? So even if they have ACEs currently, happening or in their past, reducing or preventing them now can make a difference. And you do have the power to break the cycle of ACEs. All right, Chase, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. So now we're going to unpack trauma-informed care a bit more. And so we're going to be looking at an exercise in the next 2 slides that we're going to explore together. And so I'm going to read this scenario out loud to you. And as you listen, I invite you to think about the question at the bottom. As a coffee shop owner, what kind of options would you be considering for how to respond to John? And we're not going to explore this together out loud. We will in the next scenario. But let's just take this in for a moment. So we have John, a man known for years for wandering the streets of town, has been frequenting your coffee shop often lately. He comes in, he buys a small cup of coffee, and sits at a table in the corner for hours. He sometimes takes off his shoes, has a pungent body odor, and talks to himself constantly, often mumbling agitated comments under his breath. Yes, he doesn't harass anyone, but other customers keep their distance. You have asked him to leave several times, which he does, but he shows up again a couple days later. So I want you to just take a few moments to just think about, now if you had that hat on, you're the coffee shop owner. what kind of options would you be considering for how to respond to John? Just gonna take a moment to think about that. Okay. And now I'm going to read the second scenario, and we are going to discuss the 4 questions below together. So allow me to expand on that first scenario. So we have John, and allow me to share some other information. John used to hang out mostly at a fellow store owner's shop. That store owner told you that John has struggled with mental illness his entire life. After years of hospitalizations, he now has a permanent housing and a solid support team. Apparently, John has a case manager, and that case manager explained that John, a victim of serious sexual abuse as a child, learned that if he did not bathe, people would leave him alone and not hurt him. He's working on his hygiene. 3 weeks ago, the store owner where John used to always hang out suddenly had to close his shop because his spouse is seriously ill, so John can no longer go there. So let's discuss, and I invite you to either unmute yourself and share with the group, or please feel free to use the chat feature as well. And let's just do one question at a time. So how might knowing the additional information impact how you feel about John and why? Again, you're that sort of store owner, if you would. How might knowing the additional information, and Ruth, I'm going to lean on you if you're able to read out loud in the chat for anything that comes up. So how might knowing the additional information impact how you feel about John and why?
So one person wrote, I would see if there's anything I could do for him and offer him something to eat.
Yeah, maybe he's hungry. Yeah. Okay.
So another person wrote, I would talk to his caseworker or another professional privately to see what I could do to assist. Additional information certainly humanizes John. Another person said, I would feel more compassionate to his situation rather than the impact to my business or other customers.
Yeah. And so I heard in that there's a sense of humanity, right? Knowing that there's more of John than just what we're seeing through the behaviors. So that sense of humanity. Allow me to read question number 2, and I think some of you answered it as well, but see if there's more responses. What other options for responding to John emerge when you know his backstory or assume that there is a backstory? What other options now knowing this additional information?
So one person said, I would smile when I see him. And another said, with more empathy, engage with him gently.
Yeah.
Make an effort to get to know him better.
Yeah.
Talk to his case manager to see what program he is using regarding John's background. Because he lost a familiar shopkeeper, I would ask if I could sit with him and share a coffee. So one person recognized the struggle to be empathetic versus protecting my business. It's brutal and unfair. Yeah. It's a very difficult position to be in.
Right. And so just pointing out that these options, right, may not be apparent to us if we just saw John as a nuisance that was negative and impacting our business. Then, right, the only solution is to get rid of John. But it sounds like we have a very compassionate and understanding and empathetic group. And so our third question, how was John's poor hygiene adapted for him? How does it make sense? How does the poor hygiene make sense for John?
It protects him. He might want, so it's a number of people said it's a protective measure. He might want people to get close to him. I think that might be in response to like that he's working on his hygiene now because,
That's right.
options.
Yeah. And so just pointing out that what is a problem for us, right, is a solution for John. Like you all mentioned, a protective factor, a survival. And so lastly, knowing this, what would John need to believe about the world around him in order to improve his hygiene? What would John need to believe in order to improve that hygiene?
That he could be safe, that
Mm,
he is safe.
yeah,
It really
safety.
is pretty simple sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And as
He,
you're,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead, Ruth. Are there others?
No, it's a lot of the same. That not that everyone is not as bad as he thinks they are.
Yeah,
That he's going to be safe now, and that people have a better understanding. Yeah.
yeah. It sounds like we're all on the same page. And just want to point out, right, that a punitive response, like immediately kicking him out of the shop, or maybe even calling the police, would actually make him feel less safe. So you're spot on, right? And reinforces poor hygiene in many ways. And so being compassionate and exploring all the options might help him believe that the world is safe. We're looking out for him, and he no longer needs the protection of poor hygiene. So thank you. Thanks for sharing that. That's great. And so I want to move on to unpack, trauma-informed care a little bit more. And so trauma-informed care is an approach or philosophy, and it moves away from the questions of what's wrong with you, and instead asks what happened to you. And so a what's wrong with you stance, it views John in that scenario, right, as an other, as a nuisance that's making my life harder and just needs to know the consequences, of his behavior. However, a what happened to you approach, it assumes John from that scenario is doing the very best he can, that his behavior must make sense given what happened to him. And that, right, if we do get to know that story, maybe we can work something out, like you all explored together. And so trauma-informed care, it started as a new approach to treatment in the mental health sector. And so this philosophy has now spread to many other sectors like schools, police, other first responders, the legal system, and now even whole communities are working to become trauma informed. And that's what we, Ruth and I, as part of the Trauma Informed Hampshire County Network, are trying to do. And so trauma informed care is a philosophy or approach where all parts of a community or system, we call these the 4 Rs, we realize the pervasive impact of ACEs and trauma. We recognize the signs of trauma and people impacted. We respond by applying the principles of trauma-informed care to all parts of a community. And we resist re-traumatization by providing services in a community environment that heals rather than making things worse. And so many institutions in the community, unknowingly, they conduct themselves in ways that actually makes things worse for trauma survivors. And it ends up being re-traumatizing for that person. And so some examples of this could be a mental health facility that moves too quickly to restrain their patients that are acting out. Maybe a first responder who gets into a verbal power struggle that escalates rather than diffuse the crisis. And I'm curious if you can think of any other examples of this as well. And if you have any, please share them in the chat. All right. Ruth, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah.
I don't know if anything's popped up.
Not yet, but I'll try to keep an eye on it. So, okay, so we're going to talk about using a trauma-informed lens and how it impacts everyone in the community. Right, and somebody did write disciplinary action rather than compassion and trust. Yeah.
Thank you
And
for
schools that move right to, suspension as the, first line of reaction can sometimes they don't have a choice, but sometimes there are other options.
that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Right. De-escalation techniques all day long. Yep.
Great.
So the ACE research has shown us just, how many of us have experienced childhood adversity and trauma. So whether we know it or not, we are interacting with people, all day long, pretty much in our personal and professional lives. It impacts all the sectors in our community. And so we are going to just briefly go through some of these different sectors. You can see up here on this slide a list of the kind of groups that we know can have, that people interact with and can be impacted by around their trauma. And we're going to do an exercise in a minute that's exploring things that people can do in these various roles, but there's two important things I just want to highlight at the start. And so let's start with the first one, fostering connection and healing relationships. Since people are usually hurt in relationships, that's also where the healing lies. So connection and relationships can be healing, whether one time or long term. If you've ever taken a loved one to like the emergency room in a crisis, you remember whether you were treated with kindness, empathy, respect, or with harshness and impatience and dismissiveness. So people that have experienced trauma have a template of what they expect in relationships. They expect to be betrayed, punished, left. Whereas healing connections can contradict those basic expectations and can help people form new templates in their brains. Trauma tends to breed isolation and feelings of unworthiness. People think, I can't ever talk about this. If people knew, they wouldn't want to have anything to do with me. I'm not lovable. And healing relationships can invite people out of their isolation and build a sense of belonging and show that they are worthy. The brain science now is so exciting. We are learning so much from it. And it's showing us that healing relationships actually rewire the brain. A brain after a counseling session, for example, often looks different than it does at the beginning of the session. So we like to call ourselves brain surgeons without a scalpel. Okay, and the second point we want to make is about preventing re-traumatization. So our actions, as we've been saying, without realizing it, can make things worse for people that have suffered trauma. And people who have been hurt sometimes react by doing things that stir up strong feelings in others. People with trauma can unknowingly or unwittingly invite shame, blame, and a punitive response. So we can work to resist that impulse to react that way by remembering that they are doing the best they can in that moment. And we can remember to ask ourselves, wow, what happened to this person, as opposed to what is wrong with this person, right? Extreme behaviors were and are, think about John, survival skills. They're reasonable adaptations to a damaged world, like John with the bad hygiene. There's a quote here at the end of this slide, Viktor Frankl, who was a death camp survivor from World War II, who said, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior, right? So I'm not going to read through this next slide, but just, to kind of look at this at the individual level, contrasting the impact of a safe world versus a dangerous world for people with low score versus high score. So people with low scores tend to be able to handle stress. They don't get triggered by authority figures. They have coping mechanisms that are easier to access. Whereas people with higher ACEs are more likely to expect things not to go well. Their trauma can get triggered by authority figures and other situations, and then it can be challenging to regain their self-control and clear thinking. You can kind of see some examples of this on the slide. So we're going to talk more about these impacts in the next exercise. We're actually going to do a exercise with some breakout rooms. We know this is not ideal, that we're doing a lot of the talking. Zoom makes it a little more challenging, but we have one exercise we're going to send you into a breakout room that we call What Makes Things Better, What Makes Things Worse. And I'm just going to put 1 second here in the chat. A link that I'm going to ask you all to click on. It's going to open on a new page somewhere on your computer, hopefully. And when you go into the breakout room, you will then be able to access this worksheet that's up on the screen now, so that you can just have a reminder of what you're working on. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of review this real quick before we send you into the breakout rooms. You're going to be in groups of about 5. Not sure how many people we ended up with here. So Dan's going to figure out how many rooms we need for that. And I think we probably can do maybe 7 minutes total. I think we're don't have a ton of time, unfortunately. And we'll try to send you a broadcast message about halfway through, just to let you know that you're about halfway through. And hopefully, Dan, we can give them the 1-minute warning as the room closes. All right, so what we're going to ask folks to do is, actually, Dan, can you tell me how many rooms we're going to have? I don't know how many.
Yeah, we're going to have 6 rooms.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to ask people to do, because when we're going to ask that you have maybe one person who's your sort of report out person when you come back to just share a couple of things with us. And so the folks who get sent to rooms, say 1 and 2, joining when you're asked to join the room 1 and 2, if you could start with that top row, where the people with a history of ACEs and trauma often have a reaction of not trusting and expecting to be hurt or betrayed in relationships. And you're going to work your way across that first row. So you're thinking about, what are things in my school, in my situation, that can make things better for that person, and what can make things worse? Well, it's actually the other way. Worse comes first and then better. And then the folks in room 3 and 4, if you could start with the middle row, where the person has extreme reactions to authority
I'm a little busy
figures.
right now, buddy.
Dan, you can mute again, thank you. And then the final row would be the folks in rooms 5 and 6, when you fear and the person fear and expects the worst. They're waiting for the other shoe to drop. What are things that can make that better and what can make that worse? And so this is a chance for you to just do some brainstorming with colleagues. You all may be in little different situations, different roles at the school, which is fine. So you get to hear different perspectives. And you probably won't have time to get through more than one row, but feel free to move to other rows if you do have time. That's great. And then when you come back, we're going to spend just a couple minutes hearing from folks, just so we get at least a few ideas in each of those boxes, just to kind of hear. Willing to now? Let's just hear 1 or 2 things of what you came up with.
We talked about de-escalating students and how we as paras, we do it all the time. And we're very familiar with what to do, distracting them, but then you'll have an administrator who comes in and escalates again and everything explodes. And my feeling is that administrators actually need the training more than us, maybe, because we live it.
Good point. So one thing that makes things better is de-escalating, distracting, doing the different techniques that you know. And what can make things worse is, I'm going to say maybe there's something specific. I mean, an administrator doesn't inherently have to make things worse. So could you give one example of like what's something an administrator does that makes things worse?
Well, I just related my experience where one student who was extremely upset, and we had him de-escalated, calmed down, everything was good. And then the vice principal came in, stood in the doorway and started yelling at him.
Okay.
And
so
it
yelling
just
at a
started
student.
it off.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yelling at someone is going to make things worse.
Right.
Thank you very much. Anybody from group 2 have anything to add that's maybe a little different than for that row if you did it? Justin or somebody else?
Sure, I was just jotting notes for the group here, so I don't mind speaking up, but anyone else who would like to from the group is certainly welcome. But I'll put out that the group kind of brainstormed being sure not to deliver or fail to deliver on promises, right? Anything that's an empty promise, whether that's in a personal relationship about physical abuse, if it's about a teacher-student relationship, about incentives or rewards to be earned that don't come through. That's a great way to break trust and make
great example. Great. So I'm not sure everybody could hear. It was a little soft that Justin was saying that that you have to follow through on things that you promise. That consistency is so important, whether it's about the relationship or a reward that you promised or whatever it was that you need to be able to follow through. Great. Was there somebody else from that group? I'd like to move on to the middle row unless there's something. I can't see you also. Okay. I'm going to go on to row 2 here, which is the have extreme reactions to authority figures, get passive or withdraw, or get easily set off and aggressive. So folks from rooms 3 and 4, maybe you started there. What are some examples of things that could make that situation better or worse?
I can start. So
Thanks,
I was in room 4, and one of the things that seemed to be a common thread between the participants in our breakout room was that there was a stigma that was whether intentionally or unintentionally placed on a student that was acting out via things like all calls over the school intercom, where everyone hears that a group that is very easily identifiable by students and staff alike are needed in room whatever. And everyone then makes assumptions. Oh, it's because so-and-so's in that room and they must need, they must be doing something. Additionally, there's often this entire group of adults that kind of swoops in on a student. So first of all, you got a student that's in distress and acting out, and then they're surrounded by 7 or 8 adults that are hovering over them, which is not what they need.
Thank you.
So a lot of us have, or a certain spot in the office where if kids pass by and see a kid sitting there with a tray, it's like, okay, so they're eating lunch in the office. That must mean they did something that they shouldn't have been doing. So stigmatizing a student. And something that I mentioned at the end was I remembered a student that I had who had been displaced by the tornadoes that went through Springfield. And every day at the same time, he would act out and he was starting to get punished. And then I realized that was the time of day that the tornado hit. And he was traumatized. I still remember it. This was a while ago. And no one had asked him. I said, what can I do? He just needed to, he couldn't, during the tornado, he couldn't find his mom. So he was experiencing that all over again every single day. So we allowed him to call his mom at that time of day just to check in and say, okay, I know I'm here. It's okay. And that's all he needed. And instead he was being sent to the office. He was having to talk to the principal. It was all this stuff that he didn't need. He needed to know every single day that his mom was okay and his mom was there. So
Thank you,
just
Jean.
asking somebody, asking a kid, what do you need? What is it that you need?
Wow, what a powerful example! Thank you. I'm like moved to
I
tears.
got some goosies.
I still remember, and
and
a lot
it's
of
so
us
simple.
a
It's
lot
just
of us in
taking that
Western
moment.
Mass had students that were displaced because they literally lost their homes.
Yeah.
And so they ended up in a number of schools around Western Mass, and they were traumatized.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, that's such a great example of where can be simple solutions that can make such a huge difference, and it impacts the entire classroom, not just even that one child. All right, let's go on to the last row there. I wish we had, we would love to just sit here for another half an hour, but that would be our whole time. And we do have a few more things to talk about. So what about for the category here of the fear and expect the worst, waiting for the other shoe to drop, especially when expectations and boundaries are unstated or not clear? What would be an example of some things that might make that better or worse? Anybody from one of those two groups?
Maureen
Yes,
from Group
Candace.
5. It was Yvonne and myself. So we went with the philosophy. It was quality, not quantity, because there's only 2 of us. So, and it was great because she teaches younger children in kindergarten and I'm in middle school. So real quickly, what we discussed, and Yvonne is just wonderful, by the way, is that what makes things worse when you have no clear expectations is there inconsistency. Is there classroom rules? Is there a schedule? And to make things better, you're just flipping that and addressing those needs. And in addition to that, you're reinforcing positive behavior, because I know a little goes a long way. I know, what was the thing they said, for every correction you give, was you're supposed to give like 3 or 5 positive things. And when you really think about that, you realize how much time am I directing towards a negative behavior. And I know one thing that we'd like to do is if you're acting out, we sprinkle praise around the people around them. So that way it will inspire them to be like, I want to get that, rather than taking all the attention away and getting that attention negatively. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Candace, did you want to add anything?
Just basically everything Maureen said, but something else that we brought up was that there's no definitive ending. They just don't know when are we supposed to stop? You know, when is it going to be over, which can cause anxiety. And also we call it management principles, whoever, where they're not on the same page. That can sometimes cause issues with being consistent, which is the negative. And I guess the reverse would be the same also.
Thank you. So, I mean, that theme of consistency is coming up again and again. It is such an important part of that protective factor kind of, toolbox that we want to talk about. And, we need to move on, but I think it's great to start to think about, what are the reasons, what would be some reasons that some of these practices do or don't happen? And, what can I do in my school to help foster that conversation, to think about? Is it that, I think Jean's example was just so great there of like, there was a simple solution there, but nobody took the time to just check in with this child and ask what was going on and stay curious and open. Or is there some skills that need to happen? Is there some requirements of the school that are getting in the way of us treating children well, et cetera? So great questions to be thinking about. All right, I think we are going to keep going. I'm going to turn it back over to Chase.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth, and thanks, everyone. That was a really rich discussion. I appreciate that. So we're going to move into becoming a trauma-informed community. And so we're going to briefly talk about examples of practices that different sectors of our community could implement to become more trauma-informed. First, we wanted to share this graphic, which illustrates the 3 realms of ACEs. So the adverse childhood events, the adverse community environments, and adverse climate events, which are all significant contributors to toxic stress in children and adults. And so the examples we're about to look at are just a few of the many that communities are enacting. So for example, discrimination, historical trauma, the pandemic, incarceration of a family member all have a huge impact. And so we're going to move through and talk about the different sectors and what they can do to be trauma informed. And so first, what can physical health providers do? They can screen routinely for childhood adversity and trauma. They can ask permission and provide choices when possible. They can recognize you are an authority figure, so explicitly invite feedback to level the power difference. They can also inquire about simple accommodations that can make medical exams more tolerable. Right? We could have a trusted person present, maybe listen to music. Tell a person in advance what to expect and allow a person to stay partially clothed. I invite you as well, if you want to add anything else in the chat, we ask what else?
We are going to keep moving quickly here though, so I'm not going to read anything out. But all right, so what can mental health providers do? And recognize that trauma and childhood adversity is at the root of many mental health diagnoses, screen for the history of trauma, view symptoms and problem behaviors as adaptations, as we've been talking about. They solve a problem in the moment, although have longer-term negative consequences, and use the power of the therapeutic relationship to heal. And what else?
And then what can first responders do? They can counter the perception that you are an authority figure that will hurt them. Perhaps calm the environment before intervening, provide choices when possible, and validate concerns and feelings. Validation does not mean agreement. And what else?
And what can business owners do? Post information that is welcoming, not only about what the rules are. Be open to the possibility of accommodations for customers with special needs and don't only think about the consequences. Understand that odd behaviors may be the perfect adaptations to a damaged world. Set limits in a compassionate manner. And what else?
And what can civic organizations do? Raise community awareness about ACEs and their impact. Advocate for more compassionate community. Fund organizations that are building resilience in community members. What else?
And finally, what can schools do? And these are just some of the ideas that we came up with. The fourth one there, of course, being part of what we're doing today. But you all have already come up with so many great examples. So revise suspension and expulsion policies, recognizing that trauma underlies many behavior problems. Train staff that problem behavior is often a perfect adaptation to a damaged world. Teach social and emotional skills and train support staff like yourself about the critical importance of relationships to counteract the impact of adversity, build resilience, and resculpt impaired brains. And I guess here I would add, based on what you're saying, administrators added to that. So what else?
Great.
Let's see, we've got one comment here. In a school setting, it would help if trauma information was shared with the inclusion para. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Great. All right. Well, I invite you to continue to put anything in the chat if you're thinking of anything. I'm going to save the chat at the end of this, and so we can definitely use this as we share this webinar with other sectors as well. So thank you. And so lastly, we move into sustaining ourselves, which is so important, right? So moving from compassion fatigue to compassion satisfaction. And so many people here sharing this space are caregivers in one way or another, either in your personal or professional lives. And so if you are at risk for what's called compassion fatigue. And if you care about the world at large, just watching the news can lead to compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue is emotional and physical exhaustion that can affect helping professionals, caregivers, and concerned citizens over time. And if you work directly with trauma survivors in any way, you're even more prone to experience this. So in general, our goal is to move from feeling mostly compassion fatigue to mostly compassion satisfaction. And so compassion satisfaction is the satisfaction you derive from being able to do this work as a helping professional, as a caregiver, as a concerned citizen of the community. And a critical challenge for all of us is how to keep our hearts open to people who are suffering in a way that helps us grow as people and feel some reward and hope, as opposed to getting kind of stuck in that helplessness and cynicism. And so you might experience that compassion fatigue in physical ways in your behaviors or psychologically. I know when I'm feeling compassion fatigue, I tend to feel really, really tired. I feel like I just don't have a lot of space for anything else. And so it comes up physically, perhaps feeling exhausted, behaviorally, right? Maybe some irritability, maybe isolating, and psychologically. Maybe you're having an inability to feel all that empathy that you shared before, because it can be really, really exhausting. And so since the demand for our caring and compassion is everywhere in our world and sometimes seems constant, we need to anticipate it and build protection into our lives. And so we call this the ABCs. And so the A is awareness. So where in our body do you experience the stress of compassion fatigue? What physical signs do you notice, right? So being really attuned to your needs. That B is balance. And it's important and difficult, though, to achieve because the demands for caring in our world can be everywhere. So we have to set limits and support each other in doing so. The best way to do this is to have diverse things in our lives that bring us pleasure and joy. And that C stands for connection, which it can be to oneself, noticing what you're feeling and needing. It can be to other people through relationships in our lives. It can be a connection to something larger, such as a higher power, maybe a political movement, maybe nature, volunteering in the community. And next, I'm curious, we talk about addressing compassion fatigue when it arises. What kinds of things are you already doing to address compassion fatigue when you're feeling its effects? And I invite you to put what you're doing to care and nurture and massage your heart every day in the chat, if you would. What are some things that you're doing to care for yourself? And Ruth, if you're able to share that out loud.
Yeah, and it's great to share this because people get ideas and an inspiration from each other because sometimes it's really hard to take the time for ourselves. But when you see that other people are doing things too, you're like, okay, this actually is important. I can make the time for this. One person did note that staffing shortages and emphasis on maintaining the curriculum schedule are actually barriers to the extra time to address a student's needs. So yeah, we hear that.
Yeah.
So other people are saying is knowing it's okay to say no to people. Dog walks because the dogs need little from me. Try to go on long walks, walking, reading. A lot of readers, walking at the beach, playing the piano, singing, listening to books, an audible book. Lots of walking, which is great.
Great. I love that. Thank you for sharing. For myself, I enjoy practicing mindfulness and meditation. That's what
Dancing, music.
Oh, I love it. Thank
and
you.
I'm part of what's called the Slow Stitch community. There's like an online group, and it's basically doing embroidery and things like that, but sort of without, in a relaxed way. Let's put it like
Nice.
that,
Thanks,
as a meditative practice.
That's awesome. All right. So then moving into compassion satisfaction. And so caregiving, it doesn't have to deplete us, right? It can be uplifting, rewarding. It can help us grow as people. And so it's why so many people keep doing challenging, stressful, or emotionally difficult jobs, like everyone here today. And so, because we do feel like we're making a difference in helping others, right? And so I would like to share an example from my work. When I was working more directly with young people as a clinician, I worked with a family who experienced that intergenerational trauma. So there was trauma from grandparents to parents to the children that I was working with in the home. It was still happening. And through our work together, though, the family they were really able to understand trauma and what to do with it, its impact, and begin to break that cycle. And so they found hope and new ways of coping, which led to healing and recovery. And it wasn't an easy road, but it was a very rewarding one to be part of. And so compassion satisfaction is like witnessing and attending to the suffering. What does it teach us? It teaches us courage and human resilience, gratitude for our own lives, the power of hope, and the importance of making meaning out of suffering. And so, Ruth, I'm going to turn it over to you to sort of wrap us up, if you would.
So I'm going to just go over kind of the summary of what we've covered today. And it looks like we'll have a few minutes for some Q&A too, or just more comments from people, because there was so much that came up, especially with that exercise earlier. So it'd be great to keep going with that if we want to. But just, in summary, childhood adversity and trauma are very common in our communities, and they can have a lifelong impact on health. And resilience counteracts the impact of trauma. The impact of ACEs is predictable. So what's predictable is preventable. And we talked a lot about consistency today and how helpful that can be for people. A trauma-informed community asks what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. Professionals and community members can take actions to heal the impact of trauma. Compassion fatigue is common and must be addressed, and compassion satisfaction is the goal. And a trauma-informed, well, we have, say, Hampshire County, but really a trauma-informed state builds resilience and hope. And everywhere that we can bring this awareness into our work and into our lives is going to have a positive impact. So we hope that what you're leaving with is a positive feeling and a hopeful feeling, and a sense that there are things that we can all do, even in the face of a lot of, suffering and pain and things that are happening still in our communities.